At this very moment, something seemingly impossible is unfolding above our heads. In the absolute silence of space, Earth has experienced a sudden disturbance, a magnetic vibration that no scientific model had anticipated. It all began a few hours after the passage of 3I Atlas, that interstellar visitor which, for months, has fascinated and worried the scientific community in equal measure. The magnetometers of stations in Alaska, Canada, Greenland, Norway, and Siberia began to register an abrupt change, a displacement of the North Magnetic Pole equivalent to several dozen meters in a matter of minutes. There were no solar storms, no coronal mass ejections, no variations in the solar wind to justify the jolt. And yet, the entire planet seemed to react as if an invisible current had grazed its natural shield. The first alerts went off in the space weather prediction centers of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration and the European Space Agency. In a matter of minutes, the internal lines filled with urgent messages: global fluctuation detected, simultaneous hemispheric anomaly, possible instrumental error. But it was not an error. The sensors were perfectly calibrated. In less than an hour, more than 40 observatories confirmed the same reading, a torsion of the magnetic field that expanded like a wave around the planet. What was disturbing was the exact moment. That deviation coincided to the second with the instant when 3I Atlas crossed the orbital plane of Earth, moving at more than 100,000 kilometers per hour, in the direction toward the outer limits of the solar system. The scientists are perplexed. Some believe it could be an extraordinary coincidence, a natural event with no direct relation. Others, however, observe the temporal pattern and feel a chill. It is not the first time that 3I Atlas seems to defy our expectations. Since its discovery, it has shown behavior that does not fit with any known comet or asteroid: inexplicable accelerations, a brightness that does not respond to solar reflection, gaseous emissions that do not follow the usual thermodynamic laws. And now, just as it traverses the vicinity of our planet, the terrestrial magnetic field distorts as if something had passed too close, something capable of interacting with a very invisible structure that protects Earth from the cosmos. Before continuing with the data, if these mysteries passion you as much as they do me, be sure to support this analysis and leave your country in the comments. I am fascinated to read from where we observe the sky together, because it reminds us that, despite all our differences, we live under the same magnetic shield, the same one that today seems to have vibrated before a visitor come from the stars. The terrestrial magnetic field is not something static. It arises from the outer core, an ocean of molten iron in constant rotation that generates colossal electrical currents. These currents, in turn, produce the field that surrounds the planet and defends it from cosmic rays. It is a dynamic system, yes, but its rate of change is slow, predictable. The magnetic poles migrate barely a few kilometers each year. What happened this week was something else. In barely 3 minutes, the orientation of the main magnetic vector shifted a measurable fraction that, extrapolated, would amount to several centuries of normal movement. Something provoked a sudden pull, a global deformation. The most striking record came from the Swarm satellite constellation of the European Space Agency. Its 3 satellites, situated on different polar orbits, registered a simultaneous pulse, an oscillation in the field with a periodicity of exactly 8.3 seconds. No known natural perturbation produces such a uniform and clean signal. The analysts described it as a touch on Earth's magnetic bell. In other words, as if an external force had made the entire planetary field vibrate in unison. In that precise instant, 3I Atlas was passing less than 200 million miles away, crossing the line of the ecliptic. Coincidence or causality? No one can affirm it. But the data are public, and the numbers are there. The terrestrial magnetometers and orbital sensors show a simultaneous peak of intensity, an increase of 2% in the strength of the field. It may seem small, but on a planetary scale, it is enormous. For something to achieve that effect, it would have to release a colossal energy or interact in a way that we still do not comprehend. The hypotheses began to multiply. Some physicists suggested that the comet might drag with it a trail of extremely charged plasma, capable of interfering with the magnetosphere. Others proposed that its passage coincided with a deep geomagnetic fluctuation originated in the terrestrial core, a rare but possible process. However, the exact temporal pattern is what disconcerts everyone. The change occurred precisely when 3I Atlas crossed the position of maximum approach to the plane of Earth. Neither before nor after. The synchrony is perfect. In the most private scientific forums, talk has begun of the Atlas phenomenon. Not as an assertion of causality, but as a provisional name to designate what no one knows how to explain. Some compare it to the famous Pioneer anomaly, that small but persistent non-gravitational thrust that affected the space probes and perplexed the National Aeronautics and Space Administration for decades. In that case, the cause turned out to be the heat emitted by the ship's generators. But here there are no emitters, no thermal energy that justifies an interaction. What we have is an interstellar visitor, a coincidence in time, and a global magnetic alteration. Meanwhile, the public begins to notice visible signs. In latitudes where auroras are never seen, places like northern Spain, southern China, or even Texas, greenish lights in the sky began to be reported. They were faint, but unmistakable. Columns and arcs that formed at unusual altitudes, as if the particles of the solar wind had found an open door to regions where they never penetrate. The networks filled with videos, and although many were discarded as montages, several were verified by meteorological observatories. Something had perturbed the high atmosphere currents, allowing the radiation to form those flashes. In the laboratory, high-precision magnetometers showed a distinct resonant frequency. It was not random noise, but a regular pulse that repeated 3 times before fading. Some compared it to an echo. Earth, they said, had responded to something. It is a poetic phrase, but in a certain way, it well describes what the instruments captured: an induced vibration, coherent, synchronized. In physics, when a system vibrates in response to an external signal, we speak of resonance. And if there is resonance, there is an exchange of energy. That idea, the one of an invisible dialogue between an interstellar object and Earth's magnetic field, has provoked a wave of speculations. Could 3I Atlas possess its own field, powerful enough to interact with ours? Could it be a natural phenomenon, an electrically charged core that, upon passing close, generates a magnetic coupling? Or is there something more? No one knows. The only certain thing is that for days now, the sensors continue to register small oscillations, as if Earth were still settling after a cosmic push. When I observe the graphs, a strange sensation invades me. I know the data are real, that the teams do not err. But there is something in the precision, in the elegance of the signal, that seems more than an accident. I am not saying that there is intention behind it. Only that sometimes the boundary between the natural and the deliberate becomes blurred when we speak of cosmic scales. And so, while the world continues turning without noticing the slight deviation of its invisible shield, in the silent hallways of the observatories, a mixture of incredulity and expectation is breathed. 3I Atlas continues its path toward the confines of the solar system, but the echo of its passage could remain resonating in the magnetic heart of Earth for a long time. During the hours that followed the magnetic displacement, the scientific world entered a kind of silent frenzy. The geophysical monitoring centers, accustomed to detecting small daily variations in the field, began to cross data frantically. In less than 3 hours, the laboratories of the Geomagnetic Institute of Potsdam, the Alaska Observatory, the Japanese Meteorological Agency, and the Goddard Space Flight Center of the National Aeronautics and Space Administration confirmed that the phenomenon had been global. Not a simple local misalignment, not a calibration error, but an undulation that traversed the planet almost simultaneously. What was extraordinary is that the oscillation did not travel from east to west, nor from north to south. It seemed to arise from the very interior of the planet, propagating outward as if Earth had received a pulse from its core. That idea made even the most skeptic shudder, because it would imply an energy transfer that no model had foreseen. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, aware of the magnitude of the event, immediately convened a private conference. There were no public statements or live transmissions. Only a set of internal messages and an absolute silence toward the press. Astronomers, plasma physicists, and geophysicists connected their screens, comparing the readings of the magnetospheric probes with the satellite data from the SWARM mission and the Solar Observatory. What they found was even more disconcerting: a sudden increase in alignment in the magnetic flow, a pattern that recalled an entanglement of fields, as if something had crossed the terrestrial orbit leaving behind a trail. At that point, rumors began to filter out. Some engineers affirmed, without official proof, that the alteration coincided with the closest position of 3I Atlas to the plane of our planet. Others suggested that it was a statistical coincidence. But what made the debate almost unbearable was the synchrony. We are not talking about hours or minutes, but seconds. Exactly the same instant in which the trajectory of 3I Atlas aligned with the zero meridian of magnetic longitude, the world's compasses registered a torsion. The probability that two such specific events occur independently is so low that even the most prudent were forced to admit that something did not fit. While the scientists discussed in encrypted conferences, the media began to detect an unusual silence. No agency issued official statements. There was no explanation, no denial, not even a simple "we are investigating." And we already know what happens when the informational void installs itself. The theories begin to multiply. Some alternative channels assured that the National Aeronautics and Space Administration had lost temporary contact with several satellites during the event. Others affirmed that micro-failures had been registered in the global positioning systems. The public divided between those who believed that the passage of 3I Atlas had affected the magnetosphere and those who thought it was an attempt at censorship. In any case, the phenomenon had already passed from the scientific terrain to that of the collective imagination. In the internal forums of the European Space Agency, a group of analysts began to denominate this event the Atlas vibration. The definition was not official, but it reflected the shared sensation. It was not just any perturbation. The swarm satellites registered a spiral torsion pattern that rotated in the direction contrary to Earth's spin, a phenomenon that had never been observed. If the terrestrial magnetic field were a membrane, someone or something had pressed it with a constant force and then released it abruptly. That visual image, the invisible shield of Earth deforming under the caress of an external force, became the symbol of the event among the researchers. For many, the most logical hypothesis was the presence of a plasma cloud associated with the comet's passage. However, the solar instruments did not detect any mass of that type. The sun was calm, and the ionized particles that usually arrive at Earth did not show peaks of activity. It was a vacuum of evidence almost perfect. An event of great magnitude, without apparent cause. As if the universe had wanted to remind us that not everything can be predicted or measured. Shortly after the incident, the aurora observatories began to report strange behaviors. In Iceland, Norway, and Scotland, light curtains were registered that danced outside the usual regions. But the most surprising was what occurred in middle latitudes. From Canada to northern China, witnesses began to record greenish luminous arcs that appeared briefly and disappeared in a matter of seconds. Some confused them with reflections, others with illuminated clouds. However, the scientific cameras confirmed that they were auroras, activated by high-energy particles that had penetrated zones where the magnetic shield normally does not allow their entry. The images went around the world. And with them, the questions. If the magnetic field had changed orientation, even if only for a few minutes, what other thing could have been altered? Could a vibration of that magnitude affect communications, satellites, even the biological systems that depend on magnetic orientation? The biologists recalled studies that demonstrated how some species of birds, turtles, and fish use the terrestrial field to migrate. If the field distorted, even for an instant, millions of creatures could have become disoriented. In Canada, the rangers reported strange movements in migratory bird colonies. They did not fly in formation, they seemed to move aimlessly, circling over frozen lakes. In the Arctic, the research teams registered an even more unsettling phenomenon, a low sound, a deep vibration that seemed to come from the subsoil. The magnetometer of the advanced post at Resolute Bay captured that frequency for 5 continuous minutes. It was an almost imperceptible tone, a low-intensity oscillation, as if the entire planet had resonated from within. The geophysicists compared it to the sound of a giant tuning fork struck in the distance. And just when the vibration faded, the field measurements returned to normality. The coincidence was so precise that the researchers had to accept that, although they did not understand the mechanism, there was a real link between the comet's passage and the terrestrial pulse. The media began to demand answers. In a brief statement, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration recognized a temporary anomaly in the behavior of the terrestrial magnetic field, and assured that it represented no danger whatsoever to life on the planet. But the lack of details only fueled suspicions. Why not explain the cause? Why the prolonged silence after the event? Days later, an article leaked by a group of European scientists hinted that the complete data of the event were being shared exclusively with governmental agencies. Supposedly, the phenomenon had briefly interfered with naval communication frequencies and with some meteorological satellites. None of those failures was publicly acknowledged. In parallel, a bolder line of thought emerged. Several theoretical physicists began to wonder if 3I Atlas could possess its own magnetic field. If that were the case, the encounter between both fields, the terrestrial and that of the interstellar object, would have produced a momentary coupling, a kind of interplanetary resonance. Although the idea seems like science fiction, some calculations consider it plausible. If the object transported a highly magnetized core, its passage through the solar environment could induce currents in Earth's magnetosphere. The result, a measurable vibration, like the one all instruments registered. Others, more skeptical, argued that what had been detected was the echo of a minor gravitational wave, a kind of tremor of spacetime provoked by the moving mass of the object. It would not be the first time that a phenomenon of that type is registered. The LIGO and Virgo detectors have captured waves coming from collisions of black holes and neutron stars. But none of them had had visible effects on the terrestrial magnetic field. If this was a gravitational wave, its intensity would have been much greater than what current physics considers possible. And yet, the evidence continues to accumulate. The data from the Alaska magnetometer, those from the Tromsø station, and those from low-orbit satellites show the same pattern: 3 peaks of intensity separated by exact intervals of 7.8 seconds. 3 impulses, 3 responses. It is almost as if Earth had received a call and answered with an echo. That idea repeats in the academic circles with a mixture of fascination and fear. Because if the terrestrial magnetic field can respond to an external perturbation in that way, what other influences could it be receiving without us noticing? At this point, the conversation ceases to be purely technical and becomes philosophical. Many scientists, even the most prudent, have begun to wonder if the universe is more interactive than we imagine. If there exist invisible connections between celestial bodies, matter and energy could communicate through mechanisms that we still do not comprehend. Perhaps 3I Atlas is not just an object of rock and ice. Maybe it is a catalyst, a messenger of the cosmos that awakens responses in the places through which it passes. And if it is so, what occurred with the terrestrial magnetic field would not be an accident, but an exchange, a whisper between systems separated by distance but united by the same physics. Whatever the truth may be, what is certain is that the event has changed the public's perception. For the first time in a long time, humanity returns to looking at the sky with a mixture of fear and awe. The passage of 3I Atlas has left a mark, not only in the magnetic records, but also in our way of thinking. Because if the invisible field that protects us can vibrate at the passage of an interstellar traveler, then perhaps the entire universe is connected by threads that we still do not know how to interpret. And that idea, more than unsettling, is profoundly beautiful. The days following the event turned into a frantic race to understand what had really happened. In the most important geophysics and astrophysics laboratories on the planet, the computers worked tirelessly processing terabytes of data. The phenomenon was undeniable. A global magnetic alteration had occurred and, in an unsettling way, coincided with the passage of 3I Atlas. However, beyond the graphs and numbers, something more was occurring. An air of expectation was breathed, a shared sensation among the scientists that something transcendental had just touched Earth, although they still did not have words to describe it. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration and the European Space Agency published brief statements, carefully worded, in which they spoke of transient fluctuations of undetermined origin. They avoided the word anomaly, as if that term had the power to unleash immediate chaos. In private, however, the meetings became tense. The space weather prediction teams realized that, during the magnetic displacement, the field simulations failed. The models stopped predicting the behavior of the magnetosphere for almost 20 minutes. It was as if Earth's protective shield had temporarily lost coherence, as if the entire planet had stopped responding to its own laws for a brief instant. That detail made some scientists speak in low voice, of a possible geomagnetic desynchronization, a term that no one had used before. They referred to the possibility that the magnetic field had stopped oscillating at the rhythm of the terrestrial core's rotation. If that were true, even for a few seconds, it would imply that an external force was capable of decoupling both systems. The data from the Hawaii Observatory and the Svalbard station showed exactly that, a loss of synchrony between the magnetic pulse and the seismological vibration of the core. Something had interfered with the planet's internal beat. At the same time, in the southern hemisphere, small variations in the ionosphere were detected. Communication satellites experienced misadjustments in their atomic clocks, minimal differences of thousandths of a second, but sufficient to provoke synchronization errors between global networks. The engineers of the Global Positioning System reported deviations in position calculations of up to several meters. In most cases, the error corrected itself automatically, but the temporal coincidence with the magnetic anomaly reignited the alarms. Everything indicated that the planet had received a shake, invisible but profound, that briefly altered the rules of its own internal order. While the teams analyzed these data, a series of unexpected events began to be registered at different points on the globe. In Greenland, a group of geologists drilling an ice layer detected a sudden increase in temperature in the depths, as if an electrical current had traversed the rock. In Chile, an observatory registered a slight perturbation in the cosmic background radiation. In Australia, the sensors of a nickel mine captured a magnetic impulse so precise that for a few seconds it generated electrical current in the ground cables. None of these phenomena could be explained independently, but all occurred within the same temporal framework. It was as if a wave, silent and imperceptible, had traversed the entire planet, leaving small traces in distant places. The most intriguing arose from the frequency analysis. The researchers discovered that the main vibration of the terrestrial field had adopted an almost musical form. A repeated pattern in 3 peaks, separated by intervals of 8 seconds. That triple cadence had never been seen in the natural oscillations of the field. The geophysicists compared it to the echo of a sustained note in a cathedral. 3 pulses, 3 responses, 3 echoes. Some began to wonder if we were not facing a form of induced resonance. And if it was resonance, it meant that something had touched the planet at its own frequency. The media began to call this the pulse of Earth. The images of the planet, accompanied by 3 concentric waves, went viral. Talk was of all kinds of theories, from micro-impacts of dark matter to the possibility of an interaction between gravitational fields. But in the academic circles, the focus remained on 3I Atlas. Because just at the moment of the oscillation, the interstellar object changed slightly in brightness. The high-sensitivity telescopes captured a decrease in its luminosity, an almost imperceptible variation but sufficient for the instruments to notice an energy pulse. It was as if the visitor had responded. That coincidence ignited everyone's imagination. Could there have existed a communication between the object and Earth's field? Could 3I Atlas have sent a form of energy that resonated with our magnetic shield? There were no direct proofs, but the hypothesis began to gain ground among the researchers most open to the unknown. A group from the Institute of Applied Physics of Moscow proposed that the comet might be enveloped in a self-regulated plasma cloud, capable of maintaining its structure through electromagnetic oscillations. That cloud, upon interacting with the terrestrial field, could have induced the pulse. A kind of cosmic greeting, a contact wave generated not by intention, but by pure physical interaction between fields. Meanwhile, the defense agencies analyzed the phenomenon from another perspective. If such a small perturbation could temporarily alter the navigation and communication systems, what would occur if it repeated with greater intensity? Simulations were organized to calculate how the electrical networks and satellites would respond to a geomagnetic event of unknown origin. The result was unsettling. A slightly stronger pulse would suffice to provoke regional blackouts and failures in satellite networks. The possibility that the phenomenon repeated kept the governments on alert. The citizens, for their part, began to share testimonies. People in different parts of the world affirmed having felt sudden dizzinesses, inexplicable headaches, or a pressure in the ears in the same time slot as the event. Although science discarded any direct relation, the social networks converted these accounts into proof that the entire planet had vibrated in unison. In a matter of days, The story of Three-Eye Atlas and the magnetic field had transformed into a modern myth, a narrative shared among millions who sought sense in a fact that science still could not explain fully. The tone changed when some independent researchers began to compare the event with the anomalies detected at the poles during the 20th century. In 1989, a solar storm had provoked a similar perturbation, but then there existed a clear cause. This time, the sun was calm. No eruption, no ejection. Only silence. And in the midst of that silence, an interstellar traveler passing through the vicinity. The orbital dynamics specialists calculated that Three-Eye Atlas had crossed the terrestrial plane with an angle of barely 5 degrees. That geometric coincidence placed it in the zone of maximum interaction with the planet's magnetic field. If its core contained ferromagnetic materials or was charged with plasma, its passage could have induced a brief coupling, like two magnets that repel and then separate. That interaction, multiplied by the cosmic scale, would suffice to generate the observed vibration. However, a small group of astrophysicists from the Harvard Observatory proposed something more audacious. According to their calculations, the oscillation did not come from the exterior, but from the interior of the field. In other words, Earth was not impacted, it responded. The signal detected in the magnetometers showed a delay of barely 2 seconds with respect to the trajectory of Three-Eye Atlas, as if the field had reacted spontaneously to the presence of the object. It was an active response, not passive. A resonance induced by recognition. If that interpretation is correct, it would mean that our planet, or at least its electromagnetic field, can act as a sensitive receiver before certain cosmic stimuli. That idea challenges our current understanding of physics. It would imply that planetary fields can interact with other fields at astronomical distances, as if there existed an invisible network connecting the celestial bodies. Some compare it to string theory, others to Schumann resonance, those natural frequencies that envelop Earth and that some call the beat of the planet. Perhaps Three-Eye Atlas touched a string of that resonance, generating an echo that we are only now beginning to hear. During the following days, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration continued observing the comet, but something changed. Its brightness diminished until becoming barely detectable. It no longer showed the intense luminosity that had characterized its initial passage. Some interpreted it as a natural loss of activity. Others, as the end of a cycle. It has delivered its message, wrote an astronomer in an internal forum. And now it returns to silence. Whatever the truth may be, the psychological impact of the event was profound. For the first time, millions of people understood that Earth is not an isolated entity, but a vibrant part of a cosmic system in movement. Our magnetic field, that invisible shield that protects us from the void, can also be an antenna, an instrument capable of resonating with the universe. And perhaps, only perhaps, what we felt that night was not a threat, but a contact, a note in the symphony of the cosmos reminding us that we remain part of something much larger.